Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mapping as Knowing a lecture series of the Franke program in Science and the Humanities at Yale. I am delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. It's a science fiction writer, Stanley Robinson, who will be talking to us about mapping the future of the Anthropocene. So first I want to, I see Richard and Barbara Franke there signed in to our Zoom universe. So I wanted to thank both of them for their generosity in endowing the Franke program that is allowing us to host these wonderful events. So thank you, Richard and Barbara, and welcome. And I also want to remind everyone who has signed in that we are recording this. So could you kindly turn off your videos and mute your microphones for now? And the format that we are planning to have for this evening is that Stan will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and we will take questions afterward. So kindly type in your questions on the chat. And Ty, Dr. Camp, hey Ty, hello. She will be managing the chat. And, I also want to give a big shout out to Ty, without whose help we will not be able to run this program as smoothly. And so very grateful, Ty, for your help with this. So without further ado, let me introduce. I don't quite know where to start. So first I have to control my gushiness a little bit because I am a really ardent fan of Stan and Stan's writing. So Stan, as you all know, is one of the foremost living writers of the science fiction genre. And he began publishing novels in 1984. And his work has been described as humanist science fiction, literary science fiction. So in a way, he crosses genres, although one could fairly comfortably say that what he really envisions and imagines are views of the future, but infused with an emotional, psychological, and human touch. So it's not just about robots and automation. So he is a very proud defender and advocate of the genre of science fiction. And he actually regards, and I think me and many other fans around the world concur, that it's one of the most powerful of all literary forms because it allows us to imagine futures that we all dream about and futures that we sometimes are scared of as well. So he was born in Illinois, but moved to California when he was very young, and he has remained a loyal Californian. He, he has often talked about, I want to give you a bit of a feel for him because this is one of the things about Zoom, because you can't see the person in the flesh. So I want to give you a little more sort of biographical information so that you can kind of imagine what must be influencing the way in which he thinks and sees the world. So he grew up playing in orange groves, stretching out for miles, and in a very suburban part of California that over his lifetime fundamentally transformed, and with encroaching urbanism and modern life kind of entering closer and closer in, and changing sort of the environment around him. So he was very sensitive to that. And I mentioned this because many of you who read him will see that this attunement to nature and to the attunement to how humans have been transforming nature is a very fundamental theme that runs through many of his books. So he actually stumbled upon science fiction late, relatively speaking, while he was in college. And then it made such a strong impression that he knew immediately that he was really committed to becoming a writer, and that was the genre that he would really pick for himself. So he enrolled at University of California at San Diego and received his BA in literature. And he started at that time already, he had developed the idea of writing a trio of books exploring 3 different alternative histories in which Southern California had gone down different paths. And this is the famous Orange County trilogy. Then he briefly left California and came eastward to Boston University and did an MA in English, and then went back to UCSD to finish a PhD. So he finished his PhD in 1982, and a revised version of his PhD was what was published in 84 as the novels of Philip K. Dick. So after publishing these few novels, Stan moved with his wife, who is an environmental toxicologist and a renowned chemist. And they moved to Switzerland, where they lived for a few years. And then he began at that point to write full time. Then they came back to Washington, D.C. But, eventually they just moved back to California. And he lives still in Davis since 1991, right? You've been in Davis. And they actually live with his wife and son. They live in village homes, which is sort of a planned community that shares many things in common with the community that he depicts in his 1990 novel, Pacific Edge. And so he is actually a very proud stay-at-home parent, which gives him a lot of time to write and think. And his wife, whose career he has supported, works full-time as a chemist. And, many of you have likely read, his Aurora, the Mars trilogy. I mean, I don't know where to start. And, and he has so many awards and recognition that I'm not going to take any more time from his talk today to mention them. So what can I say? I'm personally an ardent fan of Stan's, and as a scientist and as an astrophysicist, I'm very finicky about the sci-fi that I read and love. I find that it's often very hard to get that needed distance to derive pleasure from the writing, as one is always apt to interrogate the science all the time. And so Stan's writing is one that I have had no trouble with at all. And his books have been singular, as while they don't always necessarily take me where I intended to go, I have always ended up where I needed to be. So I would like to turn it over to Stan, and we really look forward to, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak, and we look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Priya, and thank you, Ty, and the Francas and Yale. It's a real pleasure, and I hope that we also get to do this in person someday, post-vaccine in a more mobile and social time. I really look forward to that. And yes, today I am going to talk about mapping the Anthropocene. And it's an interesting assignment kind of given me by Yale and by this speaking series, and allowed me to think about it in ways that I quite enjoyed. If you talk about mapping the future, then you are necessarily talking about cognitive mapping. So that's really the framework for everything that follows. And so as Priya said, I'll speak for about 40 to 45 minutes and then hope to engage with questions as well. So cognitive mapping, this is a phrase that my teacher, Frederick Jameson, who also taught at Yale for a couple of years, brings forth as it's somewhat like weather forecasting or a modeling exercise or scenario building, trajectory following. You see it a lot in the sciences and it is and everywhere else, and it's necessarily ideological. And I mean that in the best sense, because I take ideology to mean an imaginary relationship to the real situation. I like this definition a lot because there is a real situation out there, but our knowledge of it has to be imaginary, and by which I mean selective, partial, and shaped by our prior assumptions, so that we see some evidence better than others based on our axioms. And so maps become a kind of an analogy for this process, and maps too are ideological. And by analogy, think of the Mercator projection, where Greenland is as large as North America and Novia Zemlya is as large as Australia. This is a distortion that is made by some axioms that you use to put the globe onto a flat surface. Now, you can try to adjust for that. And this is exactly what ideological work can be conceptualized as. You can make adjustments to keep the continents sized accurately to the way that they are in the real world. You have to cut a globe apart and spread out your map in a kind of transverse directions, a kind of a giant triangle on a wall. And thus you get a different distortion, which is that the oceans are erased and Antarctica doesn't get included very well. So in the end, you might even want a globe instead of a map. And of course, this is another kind of map, but it's cast onto the same shape as the thing it's trying to represent. And this might be an interesting way to think of, can you adjust your ideology to get a better view of what you're looking at? And also, if you're mapping the Anthropocene, you're mapping the future, you're mapping time rather than space. And here it gets incredibly complicated because what unit of time is relevant? There's actually, this would be something to talk with Priya about in more detail, but it seems to me that I hear that in subatomic physics, there is indeed a minimum unit of time that you can't go below because there is, I think it's the Pauli exclusion principle that objects can't occupy the same space, and then the speed of light crossing that space gets you to something like 10 to the negative 34th of a second. That's a pretty short minimum, but you can't go smaller without breaking the laws of physics. And then at the other end, you have eternity, or maybe the age of the universe. 13.82 billion years is the latest estimates of astrophysicists. And I love that 2 at the end of the 0.82. That's pretty precise considering the question involves. But in between that, if you're trying to map the future, what do you do? And can you look at your assumptions in a way that, if, for instance, going back to maps of the world, that puts south at the top? And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, that there's probably assumptions that we're making that we seldom interrogate or think about. Why is north always at the top of the map and south at the bottom? When you reverse it, it looks weird and wrong. But maybe you need to do that to realize that it's arbitrary and sort of axiomatic. So let's think about the Anthropocene. What is it? Well, it's another cognitive mapping, and it's splitting up time into units, so some unit between the minimum and eternity. And this is what historians would call periodization. And again, my teacher, Fred Jameson, we cannot not periodize. In other words, you can never look at history and say, well, it's just one uninterrupted flow from the beginning of the universe till right now, and you just take it 1 second at a time. We don't do that. We periodize. And each system of periodization reveals a theory of history that is making the cuts. So you can simply do it numerically. There's the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. Numerical, and it's simple in that regard, but that's still periodizing. And then in each century, you think something different's going on. There's systems of power, imperial systems, like the Chinese dynasties. That's how they periodize Chinese history sometimes, or empire names, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and so on. There's the technological. So you have the Paleolithic followed by the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, steam era, coal era, the electronic era, the nuclear era, the digital era. These are all technological periodizations. And then you have the cultural, so Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern period, the postmodern period, which we were in until this word Anthropocene got invented, but nobody was particularly happy because what comes after postmodernism, you would have to have postmodernism, and it was clearly a provisional name. But something was changing in modernism that hadn't yet been properly theorized. So it was a tag name that started in the mid-'80s, again with Jameson's strong support, and now I think has been superseded by the name Anthropocene, but we'll talk about that. And then lastly, there's the geological. Okay, the fossil record gives us a way of interpreting the past of the Earth such that there are breakpoints along the way and names that go along with them. And this is really complicated. There's actually a stratigraphy committee, the American Geophysical Union, and geologists in general have parse the past very finely in different formats of changes. But let's just think about the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, and then after the Cretaceous, which ended 65 million years ago, with what we now consider to probably be a meteor impact at the KT boundary, a subsequent post-Cretaceous also divided into periods that eventually ended up in the Holocene, which was where we've been since the end of the last ice age about 11,000 years ago. Okay, and all of that, the Anthropocene is a word invented by Eugene Sturmer in the 1980s. And it was picked up by scientist Paul Crutzen in 2000 or 2002. He was using this periodization politically, and this is so often the case, in order to emphasize the danger of human impacts on Earth's biosystem. And he was trying to make the point that humanity had become the largest force in the critical zone from the top of the atmosphere to the bottom of bedrock, the life zone, you might say, the biosphere itself, that humans were the largest force in transforming that zone quickly and mostly in a bad way. And that was why you would call it the Anthropocene. And this definition is therefore a combination of the geological kind of cut, the human various cuts that sometimes get called big history, so that you include the planet, but also the other ones culturally, and all other periodization schemes have collided in this term, the Anthropocene, to give it a particular power and suggestiveness to our reckoning of where we are now in history. Now, I want to note on the side that the Anthropocene as such, as a definition, is a kind of a science fiction story. If you imagine that 25 million years in the future, aliens come to Earth, alien geologists or scientists or some post-human version of us come back to Earth or whatever, and they look at it and they study its geological record, they will be able to see a change point like the KT boundary that marks where humans began to intervene so intensively that it could be seen 25 million years later in the geological record of just the rocks. Well, that's a provocation. Immediately, people ask, well, what marker are you talking about? I think this question is not so interesting because if you add up all the markers, it will be undeniably the case. It could be the rapid shift in CO2 levels, although the aliens might say, well, something happened naturally. It could be the sudden appearance of radioactive elements in the surface from our atomic explosions. Could be a layer of plastics and microplastics, although will those last 25 million years, et cetera, et cetera. The Anthropocene, as where it started, has become a kind of minor academic argument or game that people play to make various points about the impacts of humans. When Europeans arrived in the New World, their diseases and their genocide killed off the local populations to the point that the areas of land that had been being kept clear by New World Native American populations reforested so quickly that there was a drop in the CO2 level in the atmosphere at that time, etc. Let's say that probably the atomic explosions will serve like the iridium layer at the KT boundary, that it's weird and there's no other good explanation, so that the Anthropocene is probably real. Now, another game in academia immediately came into play. Maybe it's not humanity's impact, the Anthropocene. Maybe it's the way we've been exploiting the Earth and other people that has made an irrevocable mark in the geological record. And so it's been called provisionally the Capitalocene, suggesting that it wasn't people, but capitalism that left the big marks in the geological record. But now this is another kind of science fiction called the alternative history. In other words, you have to, you're implying that if there had been a different social organization for humans since the 16th century, since modernization, that would have not left the same kind of mark on the Earth. You could, you imagine a Sociolocene or a Medicinocene or a Scienceocene or a Utopia-ocene, in which the geological mark wouldn't be clear because we had done such a good job of matching our activities to the biosphere's capacities. Well, I think this is very unlikely. And alternative history is weak precisely because you can't test it. It's just an assertion, but also, and therefore it's impossible to prove. And so I think it's best to stick to the Anthropocene as the name for this. That I think can be defended as a real mark in geological history. So what does it imply? Because I want to say immediately, and this is fundamental to mapping the Anthropocene, the humanity's impact on the biosphere is not necessarily the equivalent of saying disaster, of saying mass extinction event and total disruption. In other words, there could be a good Anthropocene. The Anthropocene could be a good one or it could be a bad one, and that's the first part of our mapping. The first map of the Anthropocene looks like a sort of a perfect spread out, a blunderbuss, you might say, from one point with a trajectory shooting off in all directions from a really horrific catastrophe of a mass extinction event that would hammer humanity as well. So, but what I want to say is that this spread of possibilities from right now, which is disorienting, and that's a good word to use when you're talking about maps. If the future that we're facing could be anything from a horrific mass extinction event that wrecks human civilization and leaves us in some kind of post-apocalyptic dystopia, and yet on the other hand, it could also be a progressively better adjustment to the biospheric limits and to technologies and to social systems such that we get to a prosperous age. I don't want to say utopia. Don't want to say golden age. I just want to say it could get really good. So that being the case, it's so confusing. But what I want to suggest is that from this point, if things begin to degrade and we don't address our problems right away, then what you get to is a kind of you begin to slide off into bad futures that are harder and harder to deal with. If we deal with our problems now and begin to improve our systems and get a handle on our problems, then things begin to get better and better in ways that will be robust. And what I want to suggest is it's the middle that is excluded in a kind of an Aristotelian way. The future is, it's as if we're walking down a peninsula, and this peninsula is sharp on both directions going downhill. And the peninsula is also attenuating and getting more and more narrow where choices have to be made. This is a kind of a backpacker's, a rambler in the Sierras type image. But I bring it up because I want to suggest that the moves we make now will be determinative for the next 3 or 4 generations of how desperate, if we were to go down the bad side, how desperate it would be for them to crawl back over the ridge onto the good side. Whereas right now, it would be less difficult to do it. Now, this map of the ridge edge dropping to bad or good is actually topologically exactly the reverse of some maps I've seen of our possibilities right now. And these are also valuable. So these are all thought exercises. I'm thinking of a paper in the National Academy of the Sciences that has the future as a kind of a big valley going downhill, U-shaped valley like in a glacial area, where almost all the futures lead to temperatures that are too high. And then if we do a certain number of things correctly, you could go up and sideways into a zone of safety. And so again, it's topological or topographical in its imagery. It's like a map, and it's the opposite of the map I just suggested. And yet it probably speaks to something real that is maybe focused in particular on our CO2 use. So it's not wrong, but these are 3 different maps right in a row. The blunderbuss of the future could be anything from terrible to great. The ridge going downhill, suggesting that we'd best get it right now in order to make things better for following generations. And then also the big valley drop, which also suggests that that side canyon is coming up quickly, that gets us off into a safe future. So now for the rest of the talk here, I am going to ignore the describing the bad Anthropocene because I think it's just too obvious. um, essentially the name for it could be the mass extinction event that we're heading into. And a mass extinction event could lead to crop failures, which would lead to food shortages for humans. It also could lead to rises in temperatures to where you get up into the wet bulb 35 zone, which is that zone of heat and humidity in combination that would lead to human deaths without air conditioning. In other words, overwhelming the human body's ability to regulate its temperatures. Sweating doesn't work in the high humidity, the heat gets high enough. The combination of the two is a kind of heat index. Wet bulb 35 is fatal to human beings. And it could be only 95 degrees in terms of heat, but if that 95 degrees is combined with super high humidity, it becomes fatal. And so civilization would be hammered in a bad Anthropocene. And that would mean that although humans probably wouldn't go extinct because of a certain clever resilience that we have, and there's so many of us that with the help of our social organization and technology and hanging in there, it isn't really right to talk about extinction, but it would certainly be a post-traumatic time. Like, oh my gosh, in generations past, we screwed up so badly that we don't have any fellow animals and we're only 1/10 the population we were. It would be a dark ages followed by a post-traumatic and dysfunctional human time that really almost would be, it would make the dark ages after the Roman Empire look like almost nothing, really. It would be way, 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 way worse. So let's leave that on the side. What would a good Anthropocene look like, and how do we get there? So good Anthropocene, let's think about that. What it would look like, I think, is very simple. First of all, in a negative sense, no mass extinction event. We would have dodged the mass extinction event, and the other animals would still, and plants that are all endangered would still be with us in a viable biosphere. Now that's a minimum, but it's very important because the only unfixable thing in our biosphere with the resilience and robustness of life is extinction. Don't be fooled by this science fiction trope of de-extinction. It's interesting to try it, and it might even work for a couple of targeted species. It's a nice thought experiment, but it isn't a solution. It won't work for the most of the extinctions that will happen. So we need to dodge a mass extinction event. That's the minimum. Then also, we have to think about people. It's our species. We're in the Anthropocene. What do humans do? You would want to postulate that there's enough food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, work, and security, safety and peace for everybody. Adequacy for everybody. Nobody immiserated. That would be another benchmark of a good Anthropocene. And you can also just call that justice. So a good Anthropocene, there would be justice. And then also in balance with the biosphere's energy flows and with its ability to process our wastes and our pollution. These are two very important flow questions that not only would humans would be in balance with its biosphere, but the immediate implication of that would be that all the rest of the living world would also be at adequacy and okay. So let's just say 10 billion people and hope that that's a maximum. And it seems quite likely, actually. And all of them with enough, and all of the rest of the living world has enough also. Now, can this be done? Physically, in terms of energy flows, yes. We have the physical capability and the technological capability of achieving that, which is good news, I think. And it comes out of an assessment of the scientific community's investigations. It's only possible to get to that if that becomes humanity's project. We won't cludge to it. We won't get there accidentally. And we won't get there if we pursue humanity's project right now, which is the creation of profit in the capitalist system. That's an index that is putting together any number of factors to make a number that accrues value to a small percentage of the world's population in a power system. This is what capitalism is. But the index of profit is faked on any number of levels, and it ends up being a kind of a Ponzi scheme, a multi-generational Ponzi scheme. So this is another way to map the future. systematically stealing in a kleptocracy from the generations to come, as well as the rest of the life world. So if we were going to get to a good Anthropocene, we would have to change the political economy that we live in, that we now call neoliberal late capitalism. The system of laws that runs the world right now and all of our activities in an overdetermining way, and even science itself has to get funded. This world is set up with goals and rewards that are destroying the biosphere and also wrecking human lives. This is the sad news, the bad news. It's as obvious as heck, though. There's no reason for me to insist on it, because if it weren't true, then why would we be in the world that we're in? And of course, there have been improvements. There has been poverty reduction. There are good things happening. They all happen as a gift economy on this side. None of them have been profitable. UN's Millennial Project of 2000 to lift the poorest and most immiserated people on the planet up into adequacy, that's been achieved, and it wasn't even that costly, but it wasn't profitable, and it was done on the side outside the rule of profit. And that's interesting, because if we could do that on the margin, what could we do if it was actually the whole point of civilization's efforts? So I'm going to go briefly through some other points in a good Anthropocene. One of the necessary, I mean, it wouldn't be sufficient, but it's necessary, is to decarbonize fast and maybe even get into carbon drawdown out of the atmosphere. So, okay, on the technological level, we have the means to create a steady state balance with the biosphere, but we're not there yet. We've invented it, but we haven't applied it. And right now, the burning of fossil fuels is a major impact on the environment. It'd be best to get back to 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there are various means to do that, both technological and biological. It maybe could be done, but it would be a very big, expensive project. It would have to be the goal of civilization, and maybe it should be. So here's another map for you. We can afford to burn like 500 gigatons more of fossil fuel into the atmosphere before we would hit that 2 degrees Celsius rise in average global temperature that has been identified as the maximum we can get without horrific results. 500 gigatons is 500 billion tons of carbon burned into the atmosphere. At the rate we're going, that's about 15 more years. But listen to this, about 3,500 gigatons of fossil carbon have been identified and located by geologists and by scientists around the world. And this 3,500 gigatons of carbon, about 70% of that is owned by nation states and about 30% by private corporations. That 3,500 gigatons of fossil carbon, 3,000 gigatons needs to stay in the ground and never be burned into the atmosphere. But it's already on the books as assets for the private companies, and it's already in the national imaginary of the countries involved that have the most parts of this as a national security issue. That, in other words, many national economies depend on selling and burning that fossil carbon to support everything else that they do for their people. Now, every one of these nation states has signed the Paris Agreement and has agreed to stay below 2 degrees. The implications of that create a logical contradiction in that many countries rely on selling and burning precisely the carbon that they've also promised not to sell and burn. And I'm not just talking about Saudi Arabia, although they are big amongst them, but also Russia, the United States, of course, Canada, Australia, Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. It goes on, in China and India. It goes on that these fossil fuel assets for these countries are on the books, and the politicians are thinking to themselves, we'll just burn what we can get away with before this becomes a stranded asset. There will be social forces trying their hardest to burn the whole 3,500 gigatons. And because the value of those 3,000 that shouldn't be burned, if you were to make a completely artificial exercise, would be approximately, I costed it once when the price of oil was a little higher than it is now at something like $1,600 trillion. And people are going to want that money. So here's an interesting map. There should be a world map that shows where all this fossil carbon is. You could easily coal, oil, natural gas. Where are these deposits? Who owns them? How much is it worth? And how do we compensate these nations and companies? Although I think all this stuff should be nationalized immediately. There's no private company that should be in charge of fossil fuels. How do we compensate for the loss of that money? Because each country's burn can be tracked and back in time as well. It can be tracked historically, right up and its present burn. Both can be tracked. And here's a rough cut. If we can burn 500 out of 3,500, possibly every country should only be able to burn 1/7 of what they own. And then the rest they get paid for keeping in the ground in an amortized, discounted, and over time way, because it would have taken a couple centuries to burn all that. And in other words, there is a financial aspect to the good Anthropocene that is crucial to think about. I want to come back to that before I end, but I see I have time for just a couple more points. Still thinking about the good Anthropocene. We need perhaps something like E.O. Wilson's half-Earth principle, which sounded so radical when he thought of it, that 50% of the Earth should be left to the animals, to the wild creatures, and we should keep our activities to the other 50% that's most useful to us. This sounded like a very old and distinguished scientist going emeritus and suggesting something completely utopian and crazy. And then 5 years later, European Union and other nation state groups are proposing 30% of the land be left to the animals. It's amazing how quick that came about. And the Y2Y, Yukon to Yellowstone habitat corridor is one indication that these wild zones be connected up with each other all over the earth. Humans congregate more in cities, and then there's a carbon drawdown to rewilding, as well as a dodging of the mass extinction event, which I claim is fundamental to the whole project. That leads to, of course, agriculture. We got to feed ourselves. And it's interesting to contemplate, can agriculture become a carbon neutral or even a carbon negative activity? Growing of crops, ranching, aquaculture. It's said that an acre of ocean water in the shallows where kelp beds and seagrass can grow, that acre of a shallow ocean water can hold 5 times more carbon than an equivalent acre of land anywhere. Indeed, carbon neutral agriculture and food production in general is going to be on the table as the technological work of the good Anthropocene. Very briefly, I want to mention geoengineering, but only because the word has become reified, by which I mean it's turned into a thing and nobody discusses it. What it now really means in popular parlance, especially on the left where I live, privileged white male elite imposing a supposed silver bullet techno solution that will save their way of life, but probably backfire and make things worse for everyone else. That's geoengineering. Well, define it that way, and indeed, bad idea. But if you think of large-scale interventions in the biosphere hoping to reduce the damage of a global temperature rise as being a definition, such that women's rights are geoengineering for the good, gardening is geoengineering for the good. Anything we do at global scale that has impacts because there are so many humans, as small as they might be individually, if they scale up, you could think of that as geoengineering. And then if you get to the famous case of solar radiation management, can we imitate Pinatubo and throw dust into the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide, whatever, to bounce some sunlight off before it hits Earth? That would lower temperature, and it might only last 5 years, and the repercussions might not be as significant. I mean, who can tell? But if we get desperate in the 21st century, there may be certain nation states that are whose people are dying from heat waves, who may do this, and the rest of the world, having burned the carbon, especially the developed world in the north, will have no moral standing to objecting to geoengineering just for an idea. So it's an emergency. It's like, it would be like pulling the emergency alarm and pulling out the fire extinguisher in a good Anthropocene. So let me end by going back to this matter of finance. What is money? Well, it's not as easy as you might think. It's a medium of exchange. It's a store place of value. It's a demonstration of social trust. So if you're going to do the good work of saving the biosphere and creating a good Anthropocene, you need to be able to make a living at it. And making a living is not the same as making a profit, where you extract value and hoard it to yourself and become richer than everybody else. There's really good work on what finance is and its relationship to the state. And the nation state system and finance, which is to say money, the world of finance, are codependence and they're interdependent. People like Lazzarato say that finance controls the state. People like Joseph Vogel and others say that the two are hand in hand, but those two hands are arm wrestling for control. I think that's a good image for it. But in any case, when finance is in control of the state, you get neoliberal capitalism and the bad point they're at now. That doesn't work. And we've seen 40 years of it misfiring despite various improvements on other levels. So the good Anthropocene will require state controlling finance. And if the state is of the people, by the people, for the people, in some formulation where you have good political representation as a citizen and your governments are essentially your organizations like a business, but working for you for the good of the planet, then state controlling finance is the natural and proper order because it's people controlling finance for the good. So what would that kind of finance resemble? Well, a job guarantee. If the state guarantees you a job, then unemployment as a problem goes away. But also if that job is a wage, is a salary, is a compensated by an adequate life so that you could get a job from the state that gave you a living, then all private industry would have to match it. So job guarantee, which is a fundamental to modern monetary theory, is a good idea. Progressive taxation that actually creates a ratio of if the people making the most on the planet were at adequacy and the people that the least were at adequacy and the people at the most were making 10 times that, a 1 to 10 ratio in wage parity, it's sometimes called. If you've got true adequacy, then 10 times that is stupendous luxury. But the world that we're in, it's really a ratio of 1 being grossly inadequate. And then the wealthiest are like 500 times that or 1,500 times that. It's ludicrous and it could be legislated out of existence by taxation. Then also paying off the oil companies or the nations really that own the fossil fuels is part of it. And how can we do that? Well, money is created by the central bank. So here I'm not talking about speculative bubble silliness like Bitcoin, which is really just a scam. I'm talking about fiat money made by seigniorage by the powers that be, states backed by armies and by their people. That's what real money is. And if real money is made to pay first for decarbonization work, for good Anthropocene work, and it only gets paid out for that first, that's a form of quantitative easing. We know quantitative easing works. It well, sort of works. But in other words, it goes out there and it doesn't completely destabilize money as a concept. In 2008, they made up between $5 to $8 trillion and poured it into the system to keep the economy liquid. With the pandemic in March, they made up a couple trillion immediately in order to keep people from starving. So carbon quantitative easing, CQE, is an idea that's out there. It's a great idea. You sequester carbon, you get a carbon coin. It has to be defended by the central banks. It has to be made up by the central banks in concert so that it isn't just a crypto coin or a speculative thing that can be manipulated by finance. It has to be solidly backed And then you're at something solid, the civilization that pays itself to do the right things. And we're not there yet, but we have actually the mechanisms. Globalization is not bad because we're on one planet. Bad globalization is bad, like the bad Anthropocene is bad. Good globalization is, in fact, necessary because it can't just happen in one country. There is no pocket utopia. It's all or nothing, which is frightening, of course. But we're on one planet and we have no choice in that. So I am going to end with that and turn it back over to Priya and the rest of you, and hope that that we survived our hack, and maybe that serves as a model. All the good work that we do, that is going to happen in the face of chaos and disruption and hacking and people who don't share the same ideology and are going to be trying to mess things up. So what I describe is the lineaments of a century-long wicked battle. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Stan. That was wonderful. So we'll open up for questions. Ty, did you want to get started with?
Yes, sure. So a comment, perhaps leading to a question. What would a good Anthropocene look like? The problem is more complex. Somebody noted the sad fact is that humans have not learned to be themselves without being anthropocentric. So this is what is fatal for the species. The reason being simple: no species can outlive its life support system. And the person offering this comment says, will be no exception. We cannot conceive of a world in which we are not the center. The thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I think that's right. The questioner is bringing up a valid point that we need to be more biocentric. We need to go back to the oldest religion, a kind of Gaia religion, where humans understand that they are one node in a larger network of living beings and that they all are part of us. I think the news that 50% of the DNA inside your body is not human DNA is a shocking new fact that has to change everybody who contemplates it for a while. That you yourself are a forest or a swamp or a biome of some kind, and everything has to work inside you for you to stay healthy, and then you're part of a larger system and everything has to work on that system also to stay healthy. So at the micro and the macro, we are interpenetrated with the rest of the biosphere, and that can be a religious position. It has been in the past, has to come back. In terms of the question of how it would look like, let's say cities denser, lots of more open land, lots more respect for wild animals as being our cousins, our horizontal brothers and sisters, as John Muir once said, and then go from there. It would be a work in progress, and I would agree we're not there. We're too anthropocentric, and it would be nice to broaden our perspectives to actually confront the reality that we can't go it alone, as the person commented.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, it might also be helpful that every time we as humans have thought that we are at the center of the physical universe, right, we've been displayed. And hopefully now, with the discovery of all these other exoplanets and possibilities, even with just the nearby stars harboring other planets, right, I think we need to get sort of a little bit more humble about cosmically where we are. And maybe this perspective will help us become a little less anthropocentric. But I see that, you know, there is this tension between our desire to always be focused on ourselves. But I think I really liked your point that even what we think as the boundary of us is not really uniquely us. We have bits of DNA from others, and very complex biome. I was curious, as we are waiting to use my prerogative as the organizer, to ask you. So Stan, the good Anthropocene is really what we want to head toward, but we see a lot of practical, mental, psychological, aside from nation states and that level of political disagreement and you know, ideological conflicts, to say nothing of military conflicts. At a personal, psychological, emotional level, do you have a way of thinking about how we could all effect that transformation, sort of to build towards that?
That's a hard one because different people are in different circumstances such that it's, I think, dangerous or inappropriate to give advice. My situation as a suburban white man, aging house husband in a sweet eco village in California, I mean, this is an amazingly privileged position, maybe one of the most privileged in the history of the world for a person, an individual. So I would say take what I have to say with a grain of salt, but one can drop one's carbon burn dramatically. And we saw this with the pandemic, but you could do it voluntarily as well and still have like more fun than you were before, less crap in your life, less worry and anxiety. Walking outdoors, just taking a simple walk is actually more satisfying and restful than almost any recreational activity you can name, especially the ones that involve going somewhere else and using mechanical means to get you, I don't know, I don't want to put down any particular activities, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then if you grow plants, even in pots in your apartment, immediately the first reaction is fear. It's a stupendous technological feat to keep ourselves fed. It's not an automatic. And so growing plants, vegetables or even ornamentals is a huge lesson and a little tiny bit of carbon drawdown, especially with a compost heap. But also psychologically, it reorients you to reality. Because all of us, I think, are doing this. And I appreciate very much people coming to hear this talk, given everybody's Zoom and screen fatigue. And it means a lot to me because I think that it's a gesture towards Yale and towards my novels. But all of us, that needs to be integrated with a physical life in the stuff that you can touch with your hands. And I think that is a reorientation. It's a kind of mapping activity to go outdoors, to sit in a garden, to meet face to face at socially distanced levels for the next year or so. But after that, to realize that talking to somebody over a cup of tea is already the most pleasurable activity that you have. And it's a rather low carbon burn.
Thanks. A few more questions have come up. Are there no examples in history from which we can learn, or should we really look for a clean break?
I think one has to be able to learn from history. Priya mentioned my novel, Shaman. How were humans getting by in the Paleolithic? And are there things we could learn from them? I think so, even though I often talk about the Paleolithic with good dental care. In other words, the things that we can learn from the Paleolithic is not the totality of how to live, that we are a technological species and it's good. And so along the way, medicine is one of the fundamental technologies. Public health is another one. These systems that we have. I think what one wants to do is evaluate all earlier historical societies for what was valuable in them, even though they were partially enacted, and pull them out and make them into a new thing. So I don't believe in a clean break. I don't believe in future humans that would be radically distinct from what we've been all along. But there certainly is some distinctions to be made.
Is it a Pandora's box to pay nations and organizations to not do something horrible to all of us? Is paying them out really the best practical solution to keep oil in the ground?
Maybe not. Immediately I think to myself, that does sound bad. But I am thinking about the way that we reward ourselves for doing useful things by way of money. And I'm thinking about what they call climate equity, which is written into the Paris Agreement, that the people in the areas of the world that are going to suffer first from climate change effects are precisely the people who have burned the least amount of carbon. So the Paris Agreement is a stupendously strong document on this front because a certain cadre of diplomats and philosophers and hardworking activists made the Paris Agreement the way it is by writing these things in with huge arguments. And what the Paris Agreement says is there's a Schedule 1 nations, developed world that burned a lot of carbon that are now rich. There's developing nations, Schedule 2, or, that are on the list as A and B that owe less to the payouts necessary because they've burned less carbon and have suffered more in the results. So it wouldn't be just a case of you go to Russia and say, you've got 1,000 gigatons of carbon, and therefore we are going to give you $20 trillion right now. That wouldn't work. That would crash the system. You can pressure and use leverage in the normal way of diplomacy and of money in general to say, look, we are going to compensate you, but it's at a discounted rate, and you're going to have to do the right things in order to, you're going to have to meet carbon sequestration scheduling in order to get the payout, but then you do get paid for doing the virtuous thing. And I mean, this is weirdly economic speak. I believe that economics is too limited of a way to talk about this, but we organize global society by way of economic considerations. And one part of economics is a real and genuine social science, trying to find the best way forward. The other part is just an excuse for a power play of the rich over the poor. You got to de-strand economics and get to the part that's useful to us.
But isn't some of this, what you suggest, still within the framework of transactional capitalism? I mean, it's still very much within that rubric, right? So I guess parts of that we have to live with because that's what we are built on. Can't fundamentally shake that apart in one go.
Well, not in one go. I like a stepwise march to a true post-capitalism, but given where we are now, I would say anti-austerity, Keynesianism, social democracies, democratic socialism, post-capitalism as a stepwise march from one legal stage to the next so that it's more orderly, hopefully less violent, and more effective. So I myself am a full-on post-capitalist. I would believe in, I think capitalism is just the name for a power system, but we're in it. And certainly money will still exist. Certainly capital will still exist. But what we pay ourselves to do and how we own capital, these are the big questions.
As you know, one American has the carbon footprint equivalent to 20 Bangladeshi. The US makes up 5% of the world's population, but using 25% of the world's energy. What do you think of Naomi Klein's perspective on Anthropocene discourse that the US has a greater responsibility in reducing the carbon footprint than any other country on Earth?
I am in solidarity with Naomi Klein, and I think she's right about that. And then historically and accurately, you have to immediately pull in also China and the European Union, and soon enough India. But these are at differential rates historically. So climate equity, climate justice would require that the United States leading the way would make a huge difference. You see small countries operating with a stupendous care for their land, and with a very low carbon burn. And this includes developed countries like Switzerland and developing countries like Cuba, which often rates highest on human welfare versus carbon burn rubrics. Naomi Klein has done stupendous work for clarifying these issues to a general audience. And I hope that her next book is about the global, about international finance, because although her focus on local resistance and on regional moves, these are all necessary. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient because we're in this international neoliberal capital system that will simply extract value from the top of even good local work. So I think she knows this already. And I did an event with her very recently at Rutgers. And all I can say is that it would be great if her work is as widespread as possible.
Great. So, ciao, Carlo. So we have a question from Carlo Rovelli. He says, everything that you say is very reasonable. And of course, he likes and falls on the same camp. But he says, what I see missing is the political side. In history, rarely people have collaborated just out of rational thinking and common good. Competition has always dominated unless imposed by a power. How do we move politically towards collaboration? And we had a very similar question along the same lines from John Peters, who said, recently our country voted for a candidate who openly opposed this kind of thinking. So how do you handle political roadblocks to the good Anthropocene?
Well, for me, there are two levels here. One is the discursive battle. In other words, it's like this, it's talking about it, it's convincing enough people, persuading people that your ideological explanation for what's going on in the world is correct enough to act upon. So the discursive battle is very, very important. And then I have to say, you're only ever going to get a working majority at best. So you have to give up on the notion of consensus or of a huge majority, despite the obvious utility of saving the biosphere. A lot of people don't see it that way. And with the most vigorous discursive, persuasive battle, they're still not going to see it that way because people love their views and none of us likes to change our views. So a working majority is 51%, like in the general election, but then there's the electoral college. I mean, a working majority is sometimes up to 60% before you can actually work, like in certain votes in the US Senate, 60%. A high bar in the current divisive world. I have to say, fossil fuel extractive industries are pouring immense amounts of money into disinformation campaigns and into buying the votes of legislatures who are elected on one platform and then vote on another and support the continued carbon burn. Well, this has to become unacceptable. And that's partly the discursive battle and partly political organizing and partly fighting for different laws. So the working majority can change the laws, and then the laws can change the structure of feeling and the economic system together at once. So I don't have any good answers for this because no one does. I mean, it's politics, right? It's ugly, it's irrational. It has to do with very tribal sensations of us versus them. And it's nice to try to pull away from that and say, but wait, everybody's on the same planet and everybody loves their children. And there you get back to the discursive battle. Well, that being the case, can you persuade people that decarbonization and a new way of living with the biosphere is just in everybody's best interests? But I think you can tell from what I'm saying that this is a way of saying that there's nothing but continued struggle.
Biocentric communities are all small communities. Maybe one solution is to have small local communities. And I wonder whether COVID has given us glimmers of what that might look and feel like, one participant suggests.
Well, I wonder about that. And I think it's a human fact that we like our community. My teacher, Gary Snyder, once talked about community versus network. So your community are the people that you see and talk to and interact with. And of course, in the COVID regime, this is very weird. Our communities have been damaged. Your network is everybody that you're connected with all over the world by this medium and others. So at the community level, you can organize your town. You can actually make an impact at the level of your town to do better on climate. American towns are trying their best to confront this crisis by cutting their carbon burn at the town level. That is absolutely great and something that we need to focus on. And not only that, but when you focus on that, you can see results of your work. You can talk to people. It's social activity with some results. The international situation is so, I mean, you're 1/8 billionth of the power structure of the planet, but a lot of people have more money and therefore more power than you do. That's so abstract that it ends up at the level of discourse. So I would say essentially that you need it all, and that I end up talking about the global, partly because, well, Naomi Klein and others are great at talking about the regional, and then everybody is involved with their own local efforts. And I would say that these are all great, but that they aren't sufficient to complete the deal, which is to change the rules of international capitalism itself at the level of treaties, at the level of central banks, at the level of money. I bring that into the discourse, not because I think it's the silver bullet or the total solution, but because I think it is a necessary part of all the rest of the efforts. It has to be integrated from, and it isn't even good to say bottom to top. It has to be integrated from local to planetary, let's put it that way.
So Tim asks, what can be the role for higher education in the face of the kinds of transformations that you are calling for?
Well, I am interested. I'm an ex-academic, and I'm always involved with universities like Yale here. I do a lot, and I'm thinking, talking to young people, they are actually more flexible in their ideologies, and they're learning to shape their ideologies and where they're going to throw their efforts in a career. I think there ought to be a freshman class that I see very clearly in my mind. I mean, I'm talking about the syllabus and the readings that would, in their first year of college, give them cognitive mapping, like I just tried here, an orientation to the world. This is the world situation. There's a science fictional element to that I've been incorporating. I talk to students who are, let's say they're 20 years old. Let's say I'm very close to 70 years old, a half century gap. I tell them, when you're my age, it will be the year 2070. You will be in a completely different world by necessity, because the way things are going now cannot be sustained. It will change in their lifetimes. So higher education ought to be seized. The professorial class and the administrations, and these are actually groups that are at odds with each other often, the academic senates, let's say, since they're still in control of pedagogy to a certain extent, they ought to be looking at this situation and saying, we need to orient these young people, and send them out into the world with a well-organized cognitive map for figuring out what they're going to do with their lives without getting scared, without freaking out, without sending them off into various kinds of doomism, like, okay, the world is so doomed that I'm just going to go party. Well, most young college students are not going to college in order to take that attitude. So they are well set for an education that would teach them these things and get them oriented to the rest of their lives.
So then we have a question that touches a little bit on the personal, in which Fulon asks, they're interested in whether the experience of having worked as a house husband has informed your perspective. Do you think a transfer of more power to women may radically change our ability towards the good Anthropocene?
Oh, yes, definitely so. And I want to thank the questioner for that because it's important. When women have their full set of legal rights, and I'm not talking about reproductive rights, I'm talking about property, education, and in general, the rights that they are guaranteed by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the reproduction rate goes down to below the replacement rate. So replacement rate is 2.1 or 2.2 kids per woman. In developed countries where women have their rights and are busy with their lives, it goes down to about 1.5 to 1.8 per woman, and the population begins to drop and the pressure on the biosphere goes away. And then also, this brings up all of the work that mostly women do that keeps alive the world that then capitalism can be a parasite on and make profit. There is no profit without social reproduction. And that's a word for uncompensated labor of care. So taking care of the little kids, educating the littlest kids, and nursing and taking care of the elderly, a lot of this is outside of the economy. And if it were included in the economy, profits would be wiped out. So that's one of the ways in which profit is a scam. But also, you don't want to economize care and love. So you can't just say, okay, I took care of my grandmother, pay me $20 for that hour. No, what you would need is a political economy that created the space that people could have an adequate living and still do the human work of social reproduction. Well, in most of the world, women simply have taken on the burden of doing both of these things at once. And this is why there's so much pressure on women's lives, is they've got a double job. One, to make money in the economy and do their work. B, to take care of their families, both older and younger, and maybe even partners. And this is simply like 20 hours a day. So yeah, it is super important to support the women of the world, to be a feminist. Men need to say, oh yeah, I'm a feminist, but only in a followers kind of a way, not a leaders kind of way. And also see that the laws are changed and that the rest of the world, I mean, if the United States is the leader, and it's not quite true, if Scandinavia is the leader in these issues, and there are many places in the world beginning to emphasize women's rights, then they have to work hard to pull the rest of the world along in that. And that will really help biosphere health and human welfare. Yes. And by the way, thank you for that, because that really ought to be an element of my talk, and it often is.
So in the Red Moon, you mentioned the concept of blockchain democracy. Do you want to discuss that in the context of the future Anthropocene? Does it have room for that?
Well, I think so. Let me confess that blockchain is a difficult to understand technology, and and it often gets confused with Bitcoin, which I quite hate.
Right.
But blockchain as a system of encryption that is distributed and solidifies our information about things so that it creates a more transparent world as well as a more secure world of digital information. I can imagine money being blockchain such that you can't have tax havens or hidden criminal money. I can imagine democracy being blockchain such that, and this is true at town levels in the United States, it's open government. It's illegal to meet in private. And then blockchain would kind of digitalize that. I'm a little confused as to the utility of blockchain. Sometimes people tell me, well, it's just a buzzword for us. Codes that are actually simpler than that are completely available to us. So why even use that word? And you don't want the repetitiousness of Bitcoin's creation of value by way of running computers for zillions of hours to no purpose. It's something like 2% of the world's energy is being burned in order to make Bitcoin. Well, this is just carbon burn foolishness. Mm-hmm. It's something like the economy of Czech Republic or even Israel being burned for nothing except for a scam. So I'm not so sure about blockchain. I would need the digital experts to weigh in on that.
So there's a comment from Yannick Joseph. How about the need to drastically cut military budgets?
Well, that would be fantastic, especially, yeah, the US military budget is bigger than all the rest of the military budgets combined. And the US has 800 military bases placed around the world and is a functioning, low-key functioning empire. And that doesn't work. And that, what I can say about the military is, I'm looking at the Swiss military in particular, but also all those militaries that end up being kind of an emergency rescue services. And in the United States, the US Navy, I mean, the US military burns a stupendous amount of carbon uselessly, but they're also aware that decarbonization is a national security issue. And the Navy has, run a nuclear fleet without accidents because they don't try to make a profit from it, and safety comes first. They also have been involved in rescue operations. And it's also true that in modern warfare, navies are all sunk to the bottom in the first week of a war. And so they need to be thinking about rescue and non-military confrontation. And in short, if the world got together on this carbon coin, if civilization was devoted to trying to avoid the mass extinction event, then the militaries would end up being like the CCC, one hopes, a place of service and not of conflict. And then their budgets, of course, could go way down on the high the extremely expensive armaments, the armament race. This could be brought to an end by mutual agreement and should be part of the big deal.
So let's close with the final question, which is about a word. So I thought this might be a nice way. So a vibrant biosphere and adequacy for all, along with the global security which would go with that, would be a very charismatic goal. Could we have come up with a better term than just adequacy? Would this not be the core of a powerful political movement?
Yeah, that adequate is not exactly exciting. Well, okay, here's something that I want you to contemplate. It's an old English saying. In Bartlett's quotations, it comes on like page 7 or something, and it's anonymous. Enough is as good as a feast. Now, it was hungry people that made up that proverb, and they knew what they were talking about because there were feasts from time to time when the harvests were good. But enough is as good as a feast. The more you think about that, the deeper it goes. So, okay, enough is sort of a word like adequate. But you need the whole phrase, enough is as good as a feast. And indeed, a feast being bad for you, you could change the old proverb and say enough is better than a feast. So the word very often has been utopia. The word has been utopia. Now, we the same way ideology is what the other person believes, utopia is the good place that we never get to that is impossible. So definitions matter. But I have been working in the utopian tradition my whole career with the idea that a better world is possible, and you need to describe it first in order to get to it. So I'm constantly defending the term utopian, but that because of the attacks on it, which are political attacks, what would you say? Maybe prosperity, because enough is a form of prosperity, or justice. Maybe justice is the word. So these, I think, are much more inspiring than adequacy. And I thank the questioner for pointing that out. And it is a word game because it's the discursive battle. So let's think about justice and utopia and prosperity.
That's great. There's one burning question that I think is so important that I'm really tempted. If you don't mind. So there is a view sometimes held by indigenous and post-colonial discourse that the entire discourse of the Anthropocene is a sort of white panic. Privileged white people who for the first time realize that their ascendancy in life is being threatened. It echoes a bit of what you said about the stereotype of geoengineering. Can you respond to that?
Well, I can see that. What I would say is that the Anthropocene is a word thought up by scientists to wave the red flag, to pull the emergency alarm on the wall in the hotel and go off like a fire alarm and shock everybody. We're in an era where human beings have an overdetermining effect on the biosphere that can be destructive. And so we're in the business of global planetary biospheric management, or finessing, or cooperation. Management sounds bad, but cooperation, I mean, we need to get along in our biosphere for the long haul. So there's been so much argument about what the Anthropocene means that I think that this also can be included. Some people date the Anthropocene to simply the arrival of humans out of Africa. People got to Australia, and by the use of fire, they changed the biosphere, the biomes of Australia by fire within 1,000 years of arrival. In other words, the whole history of humanity, including indigenous people, has been involved with cooperating with the natural productive forces of the planet, the growth, such that the Amazon, for instance, was a gigantic park with islands that were islands of heavily nitrogenated highland gardens. In other words, the native population of the Amazon basin was in good cooperative relations with that very vibrant and quickly growing landscape, difficult landscape for humans, and yet humans had it in hand and were living with it cooperatively for thousands of years. So the indigenous ought to always be remembered, and they are not distinct from the Anthropocene. And there's good reasons for a white panic. I mean, white people are actually a minority in the world's population, and they had a moment of triumphalism and of white supremacy in all of the worst kind of ways, and that's going to go away demographically and politically and spiritually. But you know what? To get back, I mean, as an aging white man, I can just say it's more comfortable just to be one of the group than to be anything special.
I guess in a cosmic sense, right? We are all simultaneously significant and insignificant. So anyway, Stan, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and for taking the time to answer these questions. We were absolutely delighted to have you speak at the Frankie program today.
Thank you, my pleasure. And I want to say I will have the chats forwarded to me so that I can actually see what people have been saying. I haven't been looking in order to focus on what we're talking, but I'm interested to read what people said. And I want to thank you, Priya, for the idea of having me, and for everybody else involved. It's a great pleasure. Thank
you very much. And thanks everyone for joining in and making this a vibrant event. Bye, and see you all later.